Chapter 5. Wolf watched the little wench running to her horse and knew he should have been more prepared. He would have been if he had thought she'd be this much trouble. The girl knew no fear, unlike most ladies. "Arnon, can you spook a horse?" He used his thoughts to ask his brother to help him. Arnon was injured, and he hated to ask, but he didn't have time to play around. He saw her crossbow over the pommel of her horse's saddle and couldn't let her get a hold of it. He needed to take her back to the castle quickly. He also needed to tend to his as well as his brother's wounds. She had her hand on the pommel, getting ready to mount, when Arnon appeared from the thicket and did as Wolf asked. One low growl, and the horse took off with her crossbow still atop it. "No!" she shouted, but her protest fell on deaf ears. He walked over and grabbed her by the arm. Then he pulled her toward his horse. "You're coming with me," he ground out. When he tried to get her atop the horse, she reached out and punched him on his injured shoulder. "By the rood! I don't want to do this, but you give me no choice." "What do you mean?" He pulled a piece of rope from his travel bag, and before she knew what happened, he'd tied her wrists together. "No!" Winifred shouted. "Help me, someone, please!" "I can't have that either," he said. Wolf pulled a piece of cloth from his bag next and wrapped it around her mouth, tying it from behind. Her muffled shouts were at least quieter now. But when she kicked him in the shin, he knew her feet would have to be tied too. He tore the sleeve off his tunic and tied her feet together, then threw her over the back of his horse. He mounted next and pulled her across his lap. Finally, he turned and headed back for his own castle. "Come on, Arnon. Let's go get sewed up, shall we?" Winifred felt like a pig on a spit, tied up and thrown across Wolf's lap. She jolted up and down when they rode, and felt as if she were going to end up on the ground. The ropes burned against her skin, and the gag was so tight she could barely swallow. If this man thought he could get away with this, he had another guess coming. She was starting to think that her grandfather was right in hating him. She decided that now she hated him too. They rode over the drawbridge and through the gates of his castle. She felt so humiliated by everyone staring at her. As soon as he untied her ropes, she swore she would kill him. He was greeted with cheers from the servants and knights. Those actions made her wonder if everyone in his command was as heartless and ruthless as him. Then he dismounted. Instead of untying her bindings, he threw her over his shoulder and headed toward the great hall. The blood rushed toward her head, pounding in her ears. Her stomach twisted in a knot, and she wondered if she was going to swoon. Then he brought her to the dais and laid her right atop the table as if she were the main course. The great hall was crowded with ladies, knights, servants, and serfs who all watched intently. He pulled his dagger from his side. Her eyes opened wide. He was going to slaughter her right there on the eating table. She wiggled and squirmed and pulled at her bindings and tried to cry out, but it was no use. She was defenseless against this warrior knight. Then he reached out with his blade, and she closed her eyes, expecting him to slit her throat. Instead, she felt the ropes that were chafing her wrists become loose and fall to the table. She swung at him, but he took both her hands in one of his and leaned over, trapping them between his body and hers as he cut the ropes at her feet. As soon as he took his weight from her, she kicked at him. "Don't!" He quickly replaced his body atop hers. The look in his eyes was threatening. She stilled, and he reached out and removed her gag next. "You either stop fighting me, or I'll swear I'll throw you in the dungeon the way your grandfather did to me. If I must remind you, he also kept me in a cage, and whipped me, and left me for dead." Seeing the pain in his eyes, she didn't try to fight him again. With his body leaned over hers, she could feel the blood from his shoulder soaking into her gown. "As you wish," she squeaked out. "Just get off of me before you break my bones. I promise not to fight you again." Good choice. He slowly removed his body from atop her. She took a deep breath and sat up. Then he helped her to her feet. He looked out to the curious eyes of everyone in the hall watching him and raised a hand in the air. "Today I have captured and brought to the castle the granddaughter of the man who tortured me," he announced. "Kill her!" shouted someone from the crowd. Before she knew what was happening, everyone was shouting and throwing food at her. She was so surprised at this that she couldn't even move. "Stop it!" he commanded, causing everyone to still. "This is Lady Winifred Chaserton. Even if she is my prisoner, she demands the respect of a noble." "Why is she here?" shouted one of the knights. "What will you do with her?" asked another. "Settle down and I'll tell you." He waited for a moment, and when the room full of people had heeded his command, he continued. "If my plan is successful, her grandfather will come after her. When he does, we will fight him and his men to the death to avenge the curse he's put on not only me, but everyone of Babeny Castle by his actions." More cheering and shouting erupted. Then the musicians in the gallery started up with a lively tune, as if this were nothing more than a celebration feast. "So that's why you did this," she spat, horrified to know the man's plan. "That's right." He chuckled and picked up a goblet of wine, taking a swig. Then he raised a brow and held the cup out to her. "Why else would I bring you here?" With one swipe of her hand, the goblet fell from his grip and landed atop the rushes on the floor. His eyes followed it down and then back up to her. Although he didn't say a word, the danger was back in his gaze. I thought... "What did you think, milady? That I wanted you?" His eyes became dark and angry. "Is this the way you treat all the men you hope to make your lovers?" He grabbed her arm when she turned away, making her look at his wound. "Look! You did this to me, as well as wounded my wolf." I didn't. Not intentionally. It was in self-defense. And you have me wrong. I don't want you as a lover. You disgust me." "You disgust me as well, so I guess that evens the odds. Now come with me. It wouldn't do well for my men to see us bickering, nor to see me wounded by a mere little girl." His tall form towered over her as he took her by the wrist and led her away. She felt little indeed, as he was a good 2 feet taller than she was. He pulled her across the great hall and down a corridor. Winifred had no choice but to follow. "I'm a woman, not a girl. I didn't wound you. I only wounded your wolf." "That reminds me." He turned and called down the corridor. "Stefan, find Arnon, and make sure he gets the proper care for his wound. Bring him into the castle to spend the night. He can sleep in my solar." "Aye, my lord. Shall I send the healer to your solar for you as well?" "Don't bother," he said, and turned to look at Winifred. "Red was the one to wound me, so she'll be the one to dress the wound as well." "I didn't wound you," she protested as he opened the door to the solar and all but shoved her inside. Then he closed the door, shutting out the rest of the occupants, leaving them all alone. The solar was grand. It was also warmer than the great hall. There was a fire in the hearth and beeswax candles placed around the room for light. A large bed dominated the room, surrounded by red velvet curtains. There were weapons displayed on the wall and trunks pushed together in the corner. Above them were hooks that held weapon belts, cloaks, and tunics. "What will you do with me after you kill my grandfather?" "I haven't given that much thought yet." He pulled off his cloak and threw it over the back of a chair. Then he laid his sword on the bed. He removed his doublet and tried with difficulty to remove his bloodied tunic. When he winced in pain, she realized he was having trouble and needed her help. "Am I to be the spoils of war? A trophy wife?" "What?" He looked up in surprise. He scratched the side of his face and squinted his eyes a little, as if he were considering the idea. "I suppose that would be a good idea. I can't believe I didn't think of it myself." She could have kicked herself for mentioning it now. "Help me get this bloody tunic off," he growled in aggravation. She walked forward slowly. Then she reached out for the dagger at his waist, and his hand clamped down over her wrist. "Don't even think of trying to stab me again." Her eyes met his, and she felt a connection between them. It was as if she could see into his pain and anguish. For a brief second, she almost felt as if she understood it. She licked her lips and looked away, breaking the connection. "I told you. I never stabbed you in the first place." Now, I only mean to use the dagger to remove your clothing, not unlike the way you used your dagger to remove my bindings. So, are you going to trust me? Or are we going to stand here all night holding hands?" He surveyed her from the side of his eyes, then slowly nodded. "All right. Just don't try another move like what you tried before. You'll be sorry." "I already am." She reached for his dagger, and in a quick swipe she'd managed to rip his tunic down the front. How easy it would be to ram the blade right through his heart right now, or to possibly slit his throat. She considered it for a fleeting second, but then decided against it. Even if she did kill him, there would be no way she'd be able to escape the castle without someone running her through with their sword. No, she'd just have to wait for a better opportunity. She reached out, and with a flick of her wrist, made a few more swipes, then threw the dagger onto the bed. With both hands, she ripped the tunic apart and gasped when she saw his body. His wide, sturdy chest cried out to be touched by a woman's hand. His forearms were solid, and his biceps were corded sinew and muscle. He was as desirable as he was handsome. She had to keep from crying out. She found herself unable to take her eyes off this man. Aye, he was starting to seem more attractive to her with each passing moment. It was as if she were under a spell, with her emotions concerning him changing so rapidly. "I hear you gasping at my wound, yet your eyes are fastened to my chest," he said, causing her gaze to shoot upwards. "Nay, I'm not." She knew she made a terrible liar. He was staring at her lips. Her eyes dropped to his mouth as well. "You're thinking about our kiss in the forest." "Nay!" She pushed the memory from her mind, wondering if he could somehow see into her thoughts. That kiss meant nothing to me at all. She had been thinking about the kiss, and wondered if he'd try to kiss her again. She wanted him to, but it sickened her even to have this thought, since he was now her enemy. She turned and grabbed a clean cloth from the table, and dipped it into the wash basin, squeezing out the excess water with both hands. Wolf walked up behind Winifred and purposely pressed his body up against hers. Then he reached around, grabbing her waist. He heard her sharp intake of breath as he leaned forward and nuzzled his mouth against her ear. Like animal musk, her essence drew him to her. He'd heard her thoughts as clear as day and knew that she wanted him to kiss her. He didn't know how he could hear her thoughts, but decided it had something to do with his curse. She wanted to kiss him again. Just the thought of it made his inner animal instincts want to not only kiss her, but mate with her as well. "I can read your thoughts," he whispered, brushing his mouth against her vibrant red hair. He gently brushed a lock back behind her ear and kissed her earlobe. Her body became rigid in his arms, and then almost went limp as her head fell backward when he nibbled at her neck next. Heat flared up between them, and he knew she felt it too. He pulled back to look at her. Her eyes were closed, and her chin was lifted slightly, as if she were waiting for his kiss. His eyes focused on her beauty, and he reached out and ran a finger against her cheek. Her skin was soft as silk, and her lips looked lush and juicy. And that damned scent of rosewater and honeysuckle that drifted from her body was driving him mad. Her body actions called out to him to take her and claim her as his own. He heard her thoughts again. She wanted him to hold her and kiss her, deeply. She craved his touch and wished he would fondle her breasts as well. He daringly slipped his hands upward, rounding her swells right over her green gown. Then he brought his lips closer to hers for another taste. "Lord Wolf," came a voice from the door. "Id the devil, not now!" He turned around to see Stefan holding a rope with Arnon tied to the other end. It was like a noose around his twin brother's neck. "You tied up Arnon? Why?" "He wouldn't listen, and kept snarling and growling. Since he was wounded, I didn't want him to attack the women and children." "He would never do that. Now untie him quickly." Stefan reached out for the rope, but Arnon growled at him for what he'd done. "Arnon, stop it," said Stefan, dropping the end of the rope and backing away. "I'd growl too if you tried doing that to me." Wolf walked over and slipped the rope from around the wolf's neck, running his hands through the animal's fur to calm it. He then bid farewell to Stephen and closed the door. He turned around and stopped short, eyeing Winifred standing on the bed with his sword in both hands, aiming it at the wolf. "What in God's name are you doing?" He strode over to the bed. When he did, he realized Arnon was growling at her and showing his teeth. His twin was having a bad day and always did have a temper. "Arnon, stop it!" He walked over and tried to pull the wolf away, but it snapped and lunged for Winifred. She lifted the heavy sword in both hands and aimed it right at the animal. Wolf grabbed Arnon by the scruff of the neck and pulled him away. He read her mind again. She thought the wolf was going to eat her. "Give me that!" Still holding the wolf with one hand, he used his other hand to yank the sword out of her grip. "Don't worry. Arnon isn't going to eat you." She fell on the bed, didn't take her eyes from the wolf for a moment. "I wish I had my crossbow right now." "No, you don't. That's the whole reason Arnon doesn't like you. He knows you've killed other wolves. Not to mention you wounded him as well." "I was only following my grandfather's orders." "Well, now you'll follow mine." He looked down at Arnon and gave him the mental command to leave her alone. Then he looked back up to her. "Just be kind to the wolf, and he'll stop growling." "No, he won't. He has that look in his eyes, like he wants to eat me." Winifred looked up to see not only Arnon, but also Wolf staring at her with the same hunger in his eyes. They both wanted to eat her in one way or another. She was sure of it. She swallowed hard. What might have happened if they hadn't been interrupted? When he'd looked at her that way and then touched her, all she could think about was his naked chest and also the kiss they'd shared in the forest. It was almost as if she'd lost all common sense, thinking about coupling with this dark, dangerous stranger. What was the matter with her? If her grandfather ever found out, he'd have her head. Or Wolf's head, anyway. "There now, Arnon," he said, petting the wolf and getting it to lay at the foot of his bed. "Once that wound is healed, you'll feel so much better." Then he looked back to her. "You ready?" "Ready? For what? Please don't think I'm going to heal the wolf as well, because I don't have any plans of putting my fingers near its mouth." "You won't have to." He got up and took the cloth from the table, as well as a jar of herbal ointment, and handed it to her. "Heal me." "What do you mean?" Her hands went out, and she automatically took the supplies from him. Then her eyes darted over to the wolf once again. He did seem docile now, but she couldn't trust it. "I said, heal me. When you do, you'll help the wolf as well." Her eyes shot over to him, and she shook her head. "You are jesting." "I jest with you not. Now try it, and you'll see what I mean." Her heart raced. She felt as if the walls were closing in around her. One wolf watched her like a cat and mouse, and the other one toyed with her just the same. She didn't know what kind of silly games this man played, but the sooner she did as he ordered, the sooner she might have a chance to escape. "All right." She nodded slightly and looked over to the bed next to her. "Sit down and I'll try." He did as ordered. She opened the jar, sticking her fingers into the balm. Then she reached out for his wound, once again looking at his naked chest that seemed to beg her to touch it. She wet her lips with her tongue and just shook her head. "I can't." There was no way she could touch his nakedness and not feel that same want spiraling out of control like before. Why not? His dark eyes, the color of weathered steel, met hers, and his eyebrows lifted. "Afraid by touching me you'll like it too much and lose control?" His mouth turned up into a cocky half-grin. She almost dropped the jar and wondered if he could really read her mind. It almost seemed like it. She had to think of something else quickly. "The wound is dirty, and I need to clean it first. So I'll just—" His hand shot out with the wet cloth in it. "Use this. Or was there something else you needed?" He looked at her mouth when he said it, and she felt as if he were silently mocking her and her illicit thoughts. "Give it to me." She ripped it from his hand and placed it over his wound. "Gently," he said in a low voice. She heard his intake of breath and swore he wasn't breathing as she dragged the wet rag across his wound. The wolf whined from behind her at the same time. She didn't dare to turn around to see it. "You're lucky you don't need stitches," she said, laying on the salve thick and making small circular motions with her fingers. "No thanks to you," he mumbled. Then she heard him exhale. When she looked at his face, he had his eyes closed. "I told you, I didn't stab you. I stabbed the wolf." She finished her ministrations and looked around the room for something to use as a binding. When she couldn't find anything, she told him to get up off the bed. When he did, she pulled back the coverlet, stripped the satin sheet off the pallet, and used the dagger to cut it. Next, she proceeded to rip it to pieces. "What are you doing?" He wasn't pleased by her action. "I'm making a binding for your wound." "I have rags for that. You didn't need to ruin my best sheets." "Why does a wolf need sheets?" She glanced over to his pet when she said it, but he obviously must have thought she meant him. Actually, she did. "Just wrap up my wound and let's be done with this. I have things to do." "Whatever you say." She did as told. When she was finished, she swore she heard the wolf behind her sigh. She turned and looked at it lying on its back with its legs in the air. "I think he wants you to scratch his stomach," Wolf told her. "I'll not scratch anyone's stomach." She looked back at him, and her eyes dropped down to his stomach immediately. She had to get out of here fast before he put her under his spell again. "I need to use the garderobe. Where is it?" She wiped the rest of the cream from her fingers with the wet rag. "It's down the hall to the left." He lay on his back on the bed, void of sheets, and closed his eyes. This would be her chance to escape. "I'll be right back." She hurried to the door. "Arnon will go with you, Red. And you'll wear that red cloak hanging on a hook by the door. That way I'll be sure to spot you easily wherever you go." "Nay." Her hand on the door, she turned her head and glanced over her shoulder at him. He looked comfortable, as if he were about to fall asleep. "You heard me. Wear the cloak, or you'll go nowhere, my lady." "Fine. I'll wear the cloak, but I'll not be guarded by a wolf." She grabbed the long red cloak, knowing it was probably left there by one of his latest whores, as this was the color worn by women of the night. Still, she no longer cared. If it allowed her to leave the room and sneak away, she'd wear red. "You will be guarded by Arnon. That way, I'll be sure you won't try to escape." "I wasn't—" The wolf was at her side, panting, with its tongue hanging out. Her eyes fastened to its shoulder, the shoulder that was wounded mere minutes ago, but now looked totally healed. "What happened to its wound?" "I told you. Heal me, and you'll heal the wolf as well." He drifted off to sleep quickly and began to snore. She looked down to the wolf that was staring at her intently. It did seem as if its wound were gone, though she hadn't done a thing to try to heal it. Odd. Very odd indeed. "Sweet dreams," she whispered to Wolf. Winifred tried to leave and close the door, but Arnon was right at her side. This was going to be a little trickier to escape with a wolf watching over every step she took.